over the last couple days, two prominent extreme leftist Linux kernel developers have left the Linux kernel project completely, entirely, in a massive, massive huff, making a big demonstration about how they're leaving and about how awful Linux kernel development is. And what's crazy is both of these individuals, both of these Linux kernel devs who are just abandoning the Linux kernel entirely, have gone on repeated long-term tirades about how conservatives must be removed from all open source projects entirely. And those tirades usually come with a mountain of expletives. These guys are crazy. And when these two gentlemen, these two extreme leftists, did not get their way, when the when the entirety of open source land and Linux kerneldom was not removed of 100% of all conservative developers, they decided they themselves needed to leave. That seems to be what's happening here. The first one we're going to talk about here is none other than Carol Herbst. Carol Herbst is a Red Hat employee and has worked on the Nouveau Linux driver. It's an open source NVIDIA GPU driver on Linux. And also, Carol Herbst is part of the Free Desktop organization, which more or less is run and controlled by Red Hat. I'm just going to read a couple of quotes because Carol Herbst, just 12 hours ago or so, announced to the world that Carol would no longer be part of any Linux kernel development. Quote, "I'm not really involved in the Linux kernel community anymore, neither as a reviewer nor as a maintainer." And Carol went all over Mastodon to talk about what a big deal this was and how important it was that Carol would no longer be a part of Linux kernel development and how it was a really hard decision to come to and everything else. Carol then goes on in this statement talking about how Linux kernel and open source development should not have any power plays involved in them, right? There should be no power plays, which is interesting considering that Carol has worked. Let me see if I've got a picture right here. Here we go. Here's an exact quote from Carol. "Right-wing people are not welcomed in your org." That is a beeping based take there. That's Carol's official view, that right-wing people should not be allowed in organizations. Scrolling down a little bit, "The moment I made up my mind about this was reading the following words written by a maintainer within the Linux kernel community. Quote, 'We are the thin blue line.' End quote. This isn't okay. This isn't creating an inclusive environment. This isn't okay with the current political situation, especially in the US. A maintainer speaking those words cannot be kept." Now, I went and dug up the exact quote because there's only a few words. I needed to know more. What Carol is referencing here was a post from Theodore So, a very long time Linux kernel programmer, who said the following. On the Linux kernel mailing list. "I'll let you in on a secret. The maintainers are not all powerful. We are the thin blue line that is trying to keep the code to be maintainable and high quality." He then goes on to talk about volunteers and issues with maintainership of the code, etc., etc., etc. That was apparently, because it references the thin blue line. For those of you who are not in the United States and maybe don't know, the thin blue line generally references the police officers, the police department, right? The thin blue line protecting something, protecting people, protecting property, etc. Carol Herbst thinks that any reference in a positive way towards law enforcement, laws, or police it cannot be allowed. It should not be allowed. He says flat out, a maintainer speaking those words can't be kept. No matter how important or critical or relevant they are, they need to be removed until they learn. Learn what those words mean for a lot of marginalized people. Learn about what horrors it evokes in their minds. I can't in good faith remain to be a part of a project and its community where those words are tolerated. So Carol is very, very upset and is leaving the world of Linux. Now Carol Herbst is, again, a Red Hat employee and part of the Free Desktop organization. Specifically, Carol Herbst is a member of the Code of Conduct Enforcement team of the Free Desktop organization, and puts in Carol's bio the following, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. Quote, Nazis, beepcoin cultists, right libertarians, long-terminists, tankies, tech bros, and other fascists not welcome. This is a beep head-free zone. Carol then goes on several rants about how evil Donald Trump is and how bad Republicans are, and again, how right-wing people should not be welcomed in organizations. Now, what's fascinating about this is Carol Herbst has gone on multiple rants over the years trying to exclude people, attacking people, denigrating people, vilifying people, dehumanizing people, breaking codes of conduct in every organization that Carol Herbst is a part of. To my knowledge, Carol Herbst has never been punished for those massive and multitude of code of conduct violations. It may be in part because Carol Herbst, let me scroll up here, is part of the Free Desktop Code of Conduct Enforcement team member. This is something we've been talking about a lot. The codes of conduct out there are not to have good conduct. The point of them is to be a weapon to use against people you don't like. Well, Carol Herbst is one of those people that likes to have a code of conduct in place to hurt other people, right? Notice Carol Herbst is demanding that Theodore Sow, the longtime Linux kernel contributor, be removed because Theodore Sow said the phrase, quote, the thin blue line, end quote. 4 words, wasn't attacking anyone, was just using a common colloquial statement. And Carol Herbst says that is just not acceptable. But it is acceptable, according to Carol Herbst, to use all manner of swear words to attack people, to call people Nazis, fascists, even when they're demonstrably not, and Carol Herbst knows that, to demand that people not be allowed in projects entirely. In fact, and this should be noted, Carol Herbst was a critical part of the developer of Hyperland being banned from the Free Desktop organization, right? Carol Herbst was part of that code of conduct team that determined that the developer of the Hyperland window manager, because someone on a forum he was running said something they didn't like about pronouns, they banned him, a developer of a prominent window manager, from being part of the Free Desktop organization. Xorg, Wayland, all that sort of thing. So again, another example of code of conduct being weaponized. Now, if you keep digging, the more stuff keeps happening this week. Many of you may have seen this, but the lead developer of Asahi Linux, and Asahi Linux is an effort to reverse engineer portions of modern Macintoshes, M1, M2, etc., based Macintoshes, to get Linux up and running on them. And they've had quite a bit of success, actually. Not entirely successful, but they've managed to get Linux up and booting with some reasonably decent graphics performance on Apple Silicon Macintosh. That's Asahi Linux. Well, Asahi Linux over the years has come out and made very extreme, over-the-top, crazy statements about getting conservatives out of technology entirely. Quote, I'm going to be really blunt here. If you don't care about trans people, if you even remotely think there's even the slightest hint of merit to the blatant genocidal actions that are going on in the U.S. right now, there are no genocidal actions going on in the U.S. right now, you can beep right off from my project spaces and communities. I don't give a beep about tech shouldn't be political garbage takes. Tech is made by people, and right-wing legislators in the US are trying to kill my colleagues right now. That's not a thing that's happening. There is no tech without people. And on and on and on. Hector regularly goes on these rants, as do those around him, declaring that if you are conservative or right-leaning, etc., you are not allowed to use his software. That's how he presents it, right? And you shouldn't be part of his projects. He doesn't want to work with you. You shouldn't be allowed to be in anything related to open source. Well, he's been pushing that narrative for the last 2 years hard, and it's just been making him look bad. And so now Hector Martin is throwing his hands up in a huff. Quote, I no longer have any faith in the kernel development process or community management approach. Apple ARM platform development will continue downstream, and I feel like sending some patches upstream in the future. If I do, or whatever subtree I may or may not, anyone who feels like fighting the upstream fight themselves is welcome to do so. Signed off by Hector Martin, and he removed himself as a Linux kernel maintainer because he was one of the maintainers in the Linux kernel of the Apple Silicon hardware. And there was a lot more that went into that particular round of him leaving. Hector Martin is a character and had gone on multiple rants and done some rather unsavory things related to Rust and the Linux kernel, and just was kind of funky. But what this all seems to me to be is a pattern of extremists, real extremists, not people who are politically a little left. If you're politically left, this isn't about you. You're fine. Go off the side for a second. These are people who view themselves as politically left, but are truly so extreme that you almost calling them leftist extremists almost doesn't even make sense because they're so utterly extreme. I mean, they are demanding mass censorship of people who are conservatives or Republicans or right-leaning or even just centrists or people who are left-leaning but not left-leaning enough, and demanding with expletives and swearing and vilification of other people that people be removed and banned and vilified and kicked out of projects until they learn better, and it's hardcore. And as that hasn't worked, as they have failed in their clear mission of removing right-wing people from society, they have decided to pack up and go home. They've decided to post a big giant post about how they're definitely morally superior to everyone else and they're gonna leave now. And that's what is the case with Hector Martin and what's his name here, Carol Herbst. So see ya, Hector Martin and Carol Herbst. Was nice knowing ya. So now, will they, come back at some point? Maybe, probably. I don't know. Will there be more people that do similar things? I think maybe. This seems to be a ramping up, right? People are really upset right now. People of this particular extremist persuasion within the open source and tech world are getting really upset. Now, it's a shame. It truly is, because if you look into the work that Carol Herbst and Hector Martin have done with the Nouveau graphics driver for NVIDIA graphics cards, with reverse engineering Apple Silicon hardware for Linux kernel work, that's some quality work. They've done significant work that truly has, in a technical and real practical way, benefited Linux, open source users, all of us. And it's a shame that they're getting so political about it, and they were so invested in enforcing their politics onto the Linux kernel project, free desktop, everything else, that they can't handle the slightest bit of failure in banning other people that disagree with them. And so they're taking their bags and going home. Now, Carol Herbst is still a Red Hat employee. Is still part of the code of conduct enforcement team there at Free Desktop. So I expect Carol Herbst to continue working to try and silence and ban people who are guilty of wrongthink, right? I mean, it's almost too on the nose 1984. You know what I mean? It's just a little too on the nose. But I expect Carol Herbst to continue down that road, but not with the Linux kernel. Thank you to the Lunduke Journal subscribers. Go to lunduke.com for all the links, all the ways you can subscribe, all the ways you can get all the shows, all of it, interact. There's a forum, there's a BBS, there's everything. There's so much stuff there. Go to lunduke.com. It's the most beautiful page on the internet. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes, across these glorious intertubes of ours, I do declare, end broadcast.